Well, the Democratic U.S. Senator Jean Shaheen has been meeting Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya as part of a bipartisan congressional delegation trip to Eastern Europe this week, and she gave me first her reaction to the latest video of Roman Protasevich.
Clearly, Mr. Protasevich has been coerced, and I think Lukashenko is not fooling anybody. It reminds me, sadly, of the ISIS terrorists who put their prisoners on television to talk about how they had wronged those people and the philosophy of ISIS. And for the free world that's looking at this, Lukashenko does not help his case and help himself with this kind of a display of coercing someone who's just trying to exercise the freedoms that those of us in democratic countries enjoy.
You're saying that Mr. Protasevich is effectively a hostage then?
Clearly he is. He was kidnapped. It was a state-condoned kidnapping from a commercial airliner, and he is now being held in jail. You have to assume that there is some threat to him because he's obviously coerced into making this kind of a statement. And that's not the way civilized nations behave. It's not the way democratic countries behave. And Mr. Lukashenko needs to understand. And I think it's because we're seeing this kind of behavior, the West and democratic nations are looking at what we can do to hold him accountable for that.
So during your travels over the past couple of days, you've had the opportunity to meet with the Belarusian opposition leader, Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya. I just wonder, what did she say to you about the events taking place in Belarus? And what did you say to her in terms of any reassurance?
Well, first of all, we applauded her courage and her willingness to step up to unite the opposition in Belarus and to take over a very difficult position to put her family. She's been forced to move to Lithuania because her family is threatened. And we thanked her for being willing to travel throughout Western Europe to talk about what's happening in Belarus. You know, she does that at the same time we see Lukashenko and Putin out on one of Putin's yachts. And I'm very grateful to Lithuania and also to Poland for what they're doing to host those folks from Belarus who are being threatened by Lukashenko because of their willingness to speak out. So we talked about what we might do to support that effort. We talked about what we could do to address the actions of Lukashenko. And I'm pleased that President Biden announced that he was reimposing economic sanctions on 9 state-owned companies in Belarus.
Yeah, now on that, I mean, you mentioned these holiday pics effectively of Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko on that yacht. Everybody knows they're effectively joined at the hip. And you mentioned that President Biden has renewed sanctions against Belarus, or the regime in Belarus, but rather confusingly recently he did ease sanctions on the Russian Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. It just seems a little bit of a confused message coming from the White House on this.
I think we should do everything we can to stop Nord Stream 2. I've been working in Congress to do that, and we have additional legislation that's pending in the Senate that would reimpose those sanctions.
And besides sanctions, what else can you realistically do to put any meaningful pressure on the Lukashenko regime?
Well, I think it's important that we work in coordination with the EU, and that is actually happening. The administration also announced an executive order that they are considering further sanctions. I think that might be under the Magnitsky sanctions regime. And as I said, supporting those countries that are providing a safe haven for the opposition that have been forced to leave Belarus because they and their families are being threatened by Lukashenko. So I think we need to continue to think about ways in which we can support the opposition so that they understand that there are people throughout the world who are in their corner, who are cheering them on, who are looking for ways to be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the words do come as some relief to opposition figures in Belarus, but some are saying that actually the sanctions are making life more difficult for some human rights activists still in the country. I mean, there's a quote we heard recently saying that shutting the borders turns Belarus into a can of rotting preserves, said one. We're being turned into hostages. I mean, is there anything other than sanctions and words that the US can bring to bear here? We know Joe Biden's supposed to be meeting President Putin next month. What could he offer there?
Well, first of all, what we were told in Lithuania was that while the airspace is closed and that flights have been suspended from many countries, the border is still open and people can still get across. So I think it's important to make that distinction. I think it's very important for President Biden to be very clear with Vladimir Putin about that we want to hold him accountable for the actions that he's taken, for interfering in the U.S. elections, for his efforts to repress democratic movements in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Belarus, for his jailing and killing of reporters and media. He's throwing out a number of reporters with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and that is not the way civilized nations behave. Supporting the kidnapping of commercial airliner is not something that should be sanctioned.
But realistically, President Putin has been doing all these things that you mention for years now, and there hasn't really been very much to stop him continuing those courses of action.
Well, that's why I think it's very important for Joe Biden to point out that it's not acceptable. And the United States obviously is looking at ways that we can respond to those aggressive actions. Stopping Nord Stream 2 is one of those.
I mean, just on that subject, Nord Stream 2 is just a few miles left to go before it's completed. It's sort of too late, isn't it, to try and have much impact there?
No, it isn't, because once it's completed, it still has to become operational, and there are a lot of hurdles before that happens. It does not make sense, I don't think, for Russia to have the ability to cut off energy to Germany and the rest of Europe. What happens with the completion of Nord Stream 2 is that Putin gets another weapon that he can use against Europe, and that is not the way we should hold him accountable.
And that was Democratic US Senator Jean Shaheen speaking to me earlier on the way back to the United States after her trip to Eastern Europe.